Okay, this is why I can never retell when it's in weather. Okay, well, I'm going to actually talk a little bit about a project that we're a group of us are working on. We're only in the early stages of this, so this is not actually a finalized project yet, but I am going to present a little bit of the results. And what I want to do here is try to contextualize a little bit about some of the challenges that we have, and this is going to be particularly in the setting in the United States, but I think it's applicable to a lot of the challenges that I see are going to come up today through different talks and general communication about risk and to health from heat. And so I'll first start acknowledging some of all of the co-authors. Adam Kalkstein at the United States Military Academy, Chris Fuhrmann at the University of North Carolina, Alindomar Silva, who is one of my PhD students, and Julia Cardwell was a PhD student at North Carolina, and Chip Konrad, also at the University of North Carolina. So we know is a major threat to human health in this room. I don't need to go through that. One of the things which has happened over the course of the past several decades, and many of you also know this, is that there is an absolute plethora of different ways in which we can assess the impact of heat. This can be, through traditional, very simple metrics such as temperature. There's also more model ones such as the UTCI. A lot of work I've done throughout my careers on weather types. And then there's also a lot of different permutations of how these are conveyed. This can be maximum value, minimum value, mean value. If you're talking about a heat event, you have to get into thresholds, different durations. There's a lot of different ways in which we have to synthesize this information in order to communicate effectively the threat to human health. And so the one I'm going to focus on today is one that in the United States in particular has kind of come and gone throughout its history. And I did see that there's at least a couple of talks here at ENS earlier this week on the wet bulb globe temperature. And so many of you are probably familiar with this term, but if you're not as familiar with the wet bulb globe temperature, it was first developed in the 1950s by the United States military and was explicitly developed to measure outdoor heat exposure. So this was for people doing labor, people doing training outdoors, and how you could actually measure the impact with heat directly upon. There's a number of different ways in which has been calculated over time. There's also approximations, but effectively it comes down to the dry bulb temperature, the wet bulb temperature, and then the globe temperature in different combinations. And so this has been historically used quite a bit within the U.S. military. But also over the course of the past couple of decades or so, this has become much more used by sports organizations. You can see in many places, high school sports or collegiate sports do have thresholds by which they use wet bulb globe temperature values as a way of stopping practice or pausing events or things of that sort, in a way that's kind of taken it beyond just the specific original use that had in the military. Measuring this directly is also a challenge because you need to have a globe thermometer, which they aren't around everywhere. Specific organizations tend to have them. There's also ways we can approximate the values, but it's not perfect unless you have the equipment itself. And so you can see many sports practice facilities are starting to have these now, but they can be, again, challenging to convey the information. For one, it does get expressed as a temperature, but yet the temperature value doesn't really quite equate to an actual temperature value. So wet bulb globe temperature above 32 degrees Celsius, 90 degrees Fahrenheit is basically at the upper limits of human tolerance, but as a temperature value that doesn't sound very high. To many people. And so there's a lot of different ways in which communicating this can be a challenge. But yeah, we see this start to show up in more and more places. And so how does wet bulb temperature work as an overall predictor of human health? Again, one of the challenges that we've seen is that there have been a lot of studies that have looked at this within the military setting, within the athletic setting, along with a number of other biometeorological indices on how the body responds. And there's a lot of biometeorological research where we see wet bulb temperature or other values that are then compared with human physiological abilities. But one of the things which is been challenging has been that there's actually not a huge amount of research on the systematic way in which wet bulb temperature can be used. There are different thresholds by different athletics organizations or the military. In the many places, there's a lack of systematic data collection. In fact, for the project I'm going to be showing you some of the results from, we basically used a lot of reanalysis data and approximations to get our wet bulb temperature values. And then in the United States in particular, we have parts of the country that are very substantially affected by humid heat waves and others that are affected by much drier heat waves. And how these play out with regard to the wet bulb temperature and its suitability is something that has to be further contemplated. And then we also have seen in a number of contexts the potential use for wet bulb temperature as an overall heat metric. And this is something that was never originally designed. Again, the original aspect of this was to look at the wet bulb temperature for outdoor exposure of people doing physical activity. And so one of the interesting things that we had was and I apologize, this is going to be very small, but I'll walk you through this, was to actually try to see, well, how well does the wet bulb temperature work modeling the overall heat impacts on population mortality overall. Many of the projects that we've seen here this week, that we see in epidemiological literature, look at overall mortality rates or by population subset. There hasn't been as much on the wet bulb temperature and that overall mortality as there should be. And so the statistical relationship was done across the 107 largest metro areas in the United States. We have a very rich database going back at mortality for over 40 years. In this project, we're just using the last 20 years for which this is available to try to have it more grounded in the modern day. Mortality data for National Center for Health Statistics. Heat exposure, we have data that's aggregated at the county level based on population weighting. And so we have wet bulb temperature and other heat index metrics that are available at that level that we're integrating. And then we use the DLNMs, the distributed lag nonlinear model that I'm sure many of you in this room are familiar with. I won't get into the details of that due to time, but I've been happy to talk about that as it comes out. So the original idea that we had was to look at the overall relationship between wet bulb temperature, mortality, and then heat index and all-cause mortality. Not saying heat index itself is the best metric. There's a lot of issues with that. But the main reason that this is picked to compare wet bulb temperatures because in the U.S. that's what the National Weather Service uses, and so trying to then ground the potential use of wet bulb temperature versus existing metric is something that was of interest to us. So we looked at all-cause mortality, men and women. And one of the reasons that our initial breakdown was by gender was because a lot of the assessments of wet bulb temperature were originally developed with men from the initial assessment. So we wanted to see if there was a difference in response. And so you probably also, or many of you are familiar with the overall response curves. In some of the larger cities that we've looked at, like New York City, we can see the curves all relatively similar. And so you don't really see much of response. In a number of drier cities, so Phoenix, you do have occasional humid heat waves in a late summer, but most of the heat waves are very hot and dry. You do see that, and it's a little bit hard to tell here, but if you actually do a comparison, you can actually see a little bit more response with the heat index than to do with the wet bulb envelope temperature. Other places, you have a lot more complicated results. And there's also a lot of assumptions here. I don't want to get into all the assumptions with the DL&M. But then you do actually see in some places where in the southern United States, Birmingham, Alabama is one of the central areas where you do see a lot of adaptation of the wet bulb envelope temperature. You do see a fairly strong response in terms of males to the wet bulb envelope temperature, stronger than you do with anything else, and also stronger than the response is for females. Whether this has anything to do with outdoor activity or not is something that we don't have the access to data to at this point. This is just overall all-cause mortality. So I'm not trying to say that this has something to do with that, but it is interesting to see that the number of the humid cities in the southeastern and south central United States, where the wet bulb envelope temperature tends to have the most common use in many athletic settings, you actually do see some sort of an increased response and sensitivity to wet bulb envelope temperature. And again, there's a lot of these, and this is the initial starting point. So for her research response, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this. But one thing that I will say for the synthesis of what we had so far, the response of is the heat index is overall greater than the wet bulb envelope temperature in most cases, except for some of the places in the southeastern U.S. Men are more heat vulnerable than women overall. There's been a lot of studies on this, so this is not something that's new by any means. But we do actually also see a lot of variability by metro area. And so we've also kind of played with different values of maximum versus minimum versus mean. In the case of heat index or apparent temperature, a lot of other metrics, there's a lot of statistics on daily B values or minimum values. We all, a lot of us know about the importance of cooling off overnight. Wet bulb envelope temperature basically becomes more or less meaningless as a metric at night because there is no effective radiation on the globe. And so in many cases where you have drier climates and wet bulb envelope temperature goes down enormously at night, it becomes a much less useful metric. And so in our case here, we basically ended up modeling everything with maximum values as a way of doing these comparisons. We're now at the point where we just started doing meta-analysis by climate type. One of the advantages that we have of having a very large number of metro areas, and I only picked 4 to show just as example, not that those are the end of all the results, was that we can do the meta-analysis according to whether the wet bulb component is a bigger driver, so that you have very humid heat waves, or whether it's a globe temperature that's a big driver, so you have drier heat zones. And so that's going to be one of our next steps. We also are then going to be looking at different subpopulations. This is not something that we've done yet. When we have a meta-analysis, we'll have their statistical power. Ultimately, though, and where I want to bring this back to, comes back to the overall aspect of communication. And so in the United States, heat index has been around for a very extended period of time. It's morphed in terms of how that translates into heat warnings or heat advisories, and I won't go into all of that, but it's something that's well known. There's been a large number of other metrics. You can look at a lot of the weather apps now that most people look at, and there's feels like temperatures, which come from a variety of different sources. I'm sure many other places, it's the same thing, where there's a lot of different metrics of apparent temperatures of some sort. There's a lot of communication challenges between epidemiologists that look at overall health relationships, and then the Weather Service, which in the United States has used heat index, and how all of this is communicated. The other thing which is interesting now, many of you, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, there's an experimental product developed by the National Weather Service called heat risk. And so the heat risk is a scale from 0 to 4. It actually emulates heat exposure or heat warning metrics. I know they're available in many other places in the world where you have different color levels of warnings. So this is somewhat similar to some products that are in existence. Also, for the population, it looks a lot like tornado scale, hurricane scale, where you go up in intensity and you go up in impact. This is based on excessive threshold that's relative to the time of year. I won't get into the details of that, but if you are not familiar with it and you Google National Weather Service heat risk, you can see all the calculations that are involved. But it does come up with a very substantial, interesting looking graph. We had a late season heat wave in the Midwestern United States a couple of weeks ago. You could see very clearly the conveyance of the exceedance of the threshold. The 4 purple category is the highest form. If you look at social media, you will now see this start to play a much more important role in communicating heat risk in the United States. And so it's interesting to me, and this is something where I would be eager to hear your thoughts and also see how we have this discussion, is that with the communication challenges, there are newer products that are being developed very often, whether actually take products that you're not even sure what the genesis of, maybe of the formula that goes into them, and how we can effectively communicate heat risk. Because this, again, is something that within the United States is very experimental. And one of the challenges that we do have in the U.S. is that the National Weather Service does have their own products, but then a lot of the heat warnings are issued by local health authorities. And so there can be a very strong disconnect between what the health authority uses and what the Weather Service uses. And so how we all bring this together to try to convey the risks of heat and to what population is something that I feel in the last decade or so, the plethora of information in some ways has become even more challenging. And so with that, I'll conclude and happy to engage in any discussion either on the research itself or with regard to the various indices. So thank you.